Alrighty, so let's make a start, and obviously as we let people trickle in, that's more than fine, and we can kind of go from there. So first of all, thank you so much to everyone that's joined tonight. It's really lovely to see so many of you joining for the third part of our interview series. So it's really great to have everyone back, and welcome if you're new to the series as well. So just before we get going, I want to give a shout out to the Bite Medicine platform. I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that it includes a question bank and also an online textbook. And I can really vouch for the quality of this resource because I've used it myself during medical school. So if you haven't already, do go and check it out. It is such an invaluable resource and I'd really recommend it. So just before we get going, as usual, I'm going to do a little bit of introduction about myself for anyone who's new in the audience. So hello, everybody. My name is Shivani. I am a graduate of the University of Birmingham Med School, and I applied to the SFP last year in the West Midlands and in London. I'm currently an SFP doctor in medical education in the West Midlands, and I'm looking towards a clinical and academic career in respiratory medicine or acute medicine. And I've got my contact details there at the bottom. So in case you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So please do just drop me an email or send me a message on Twitter and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. So this is kind of an overview of the series. So as you can see, we've done some of the sessions already, including 2 of the previous interview stations. And in case you haven't had a chance to take a look at them, the Bite Medicine team have been amazing, and they've recently made the clinical station and academic station videos freely available on YouTube. So if you haven't seen it already, or if you want to go back and watch them, please head over to the Bite Medicine YouTube channel and you'll be able to find those 2 YouTube videos there ready for you to watch whenever you fancy. But today we're going to be focusing on the 3rd type of station that you might encounter in an SFP interview, and that is the motivation station. So in today's session, what we're going to be going through is what exactly this station is and what it might look like. And we're going to be talking about the 2 main formats of questions in this station and how to go about answering them. And finally, as usual, I'm going to be sharing some top tips from my experience for how to prepare for this type of station. And this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to find all of the slides and information on the Bite Medicine platform, and the video will be posted to YouTube afterwards as well. So as usual, just to get an idea of where everybody's at in terms of preparation for the interview, I always like to start with a few questions. So we're going to be using menti.com for this. So if you want to head over to menti.com, firstly, I'd like to find out a bit about where you are in terms of your medical school training. So if you go over to menti.com and use the code 67853523, just let me know what year group you guys are in. And don't be shy, this is completely anonymous, so yeah, feel free to send in an answer. Okay, so final years so far, lovely. Yeah, mainly final years. That's great. So this session is probably perfectly pitched to you because I imagine you're starting to think more and more about the SFP interviews. So if we go back to the presentation, how much do you know about what the motivation station actually is and how you'd go about approaching it in the interview? So again, if we go back to Menti, just vote again, it's completely anonymous. Just let me know what you already know about this station. Okay, so we're not feeling too confident on this type of station, so that's okay. We're a bit mixed. Let's go through it together today. Hopefully I can give you lots of useful tips that you can take advantage of and kind of either help you build a foundation or build on what you already know. So my last question for you is, do you know of any answer structures you can use when approaching questions in this particular station? So again, if we go back to Menti, let me know if you're aware of any structures. Okay. Sure, so we're not too confident, some ideas potentially. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this session, you guys will be able to give me a couple of really key structures that you can use as a kind of get out of jail free card for all of these types of questions. So we can aim towards that for the end of the session. Lovely. So thank you so much for participating in that. Let's crack on and introduce this station. So first of all, it's important to think about what this station actually is. So essentially, the crux of this station is to assess whether you have a good understanding of what the SFP is and your kind of motivation for pursuing further academic training on the integrated academic pathway. And secondly, they want to assess whether you've taken the time to obtain relevant experience and what skills you could potentially bring to the program. So the way this is tested very much depends on the deanery, but in my experience, it usually involves the interviewers in a sort of panel asking you direct questions about your experience and your interests. And so essentially, this is probably one of the stations that plays best into your strong suits, and it's an opportunity for you to really sell the experience you have to your prospective deanery. So if we think about what the motivation station can involve, there are two main types of station that you could potentially come across. So the first type of station is a station centered around your motivation for the program. And the second is kind of centered around what skills you could potentially bring to the program. So as I say, the first type of station is all about talking about your career goals and demonstrating how you think the program will help you. Whereas the second station is all about bringing in your relevant experience and working out how you think the program could potentially help you. So in terms of kind of approaching motivational questions, this is kind of the station that involves testing your understanding of the program and how it complements your career goals. And so you can see in the little bubbles the kinds of questions they might ask you about your understanding of academic training. So classical things you'll come across are why you want to do the SFP, why you've chosen particular posts and deaneries, and also where you see yourself in 5 to 10 years' time, which is always centered around your future career goals. So to be able to answer this question effectively, it's really important that you have a good idea of what SFP training actually is, which we talked about in the very first session, and also this integrated academic training pathway and what each of the components of the pathway can do to benefit you. So I talked a bit about what the program actually consists of in the first session, but just to kind of recap, the main benefit of the SFP program is it gives you an early taster in research experience. And the key benefit of doing an SFP as opposed to foundation training is the fact that you get a protected block in which to work on an academic skill of your choice. And that's not something you would gain otherwise. So if you were to do the foundation program, by and large, a lot of the work you would do in terms of academia would have to occur in your free time around your clinical working hours. So that's kind of what the main benefit of the AFP or SFP is. And as part of that, a lot of the deaneries will offer training in certain skills, for example, education qualifications or research skills lectures that you can attend as part of the program. So moving on to kind of the specialty training phase of the academic training pathway, the ACF and clinical lectureship are kind of either side programs to enable you to gain more relevant research and academic experience and empower you to pursue a higher education qualification, typically a PhD or an MD. So an ACF program, again, gives you that benefit of protected time in which you can work on a project and work on research skills that would enable you to undertake a PhD. And once you've done that PhD or MD, you can step back into the program on the clinical lectureship, which will enable you to apply the skills of your PhD to producing more research or applying your education skills to higher education in more formal posts. So that's kind of the main benefit of those programs. And finally, in terms of kind of when you reach the senior level, as I said in the first talk, this often involves a more even balance between your clinical and research work. So the key benefit is, again, you get this protected time and you get more easy access to academic opportunities. So formal research posts in the NHS, also formal teaching posts through the university, and higher leadership roles as well. So those are the kind of main benefits of the senior positions. And as I say, the key in all of this is having the protected time worked into your schedule to be able to do these activities. So understanding those benefits is really important when thinking about your motivation to do these programs. So let's now think about how we can apply that if we were asked one of these sorts of questions. And the structure that I'm going to teach you today is called the CAMP structure. So whenever you're asked one of these motivation questions, this is your kind of get out of jail free card to be able to answer this question in a systematic way every time. So what does CAMP actually stand for? So the first aspect is the clinical role. And essentially what this means is what specialty and what interest from a clinical perspective do you see yourself doing in the future, or where do you see your clinical role as a doctor heading? And particularly relevant for the SFP as well, it's important to think about the clinical rotations that come with your post. Because don't forget, when you're on the SFP, although you have that protected one rotation, 5 of the 6 rotations are going to be clinical roles where you're working clinically full time. So you've got to think about what the advantage of those posts are that come with your academic block and how they would help you in the future. The second thing to think about is your academic role. So this is very much, what do you see yourself doing from an academic point of view? And remember, linking back to the first talk, this is not just about research. Think about your teaching and leadership roles as well. And this is a key opportunity for you to demonstrate that you understand the academic training pathway and how the SFP sets you up towards those higher training posts. Next aspect is leadership and management. So essentially, you've got to think about what roles in these 2 aspects would you like to have both in your post as an SFP doctor and going forward. And as part of this, it's also important to think about service improvement as well, because this is a large portion of a clinical doctor's role, and it's really important to demonstrate an awareness of that and show an interest in that. And the final part of the CAMP structure is your personal priorities, because don't forget, you are a well-rounded human and it's important to acknowledge that. So think about what you would like to be doing in terms of kind of your personal life. Where would you like to be in the country, and what interests would you like to have time for in the future as well? So in following the CAMP structure for these sorts of motivational questions, we can cover quite a wide range of bases and give quite a well-rounded and structured answer consistently for these sorts of questions. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate an example of this, just so that you get an idea of how to actually apply this structure. So imagine that I've got an interviewer and they've asked me why I want to do the SFP. So this is an example of an answer that I could give using the CAMP structure. From a clinical perspective, I believe this SFP offers a good breadth of rotations to gain a strong foundation in medicine, which will set me up for further medical training. From an academic perspective, the post offers the opportunity to gain more significant teaching experience and education qualifications. And having spoken to previous SFPs, there are lots of research opportunities that I could capitalize on to build my previous experience. From a leadership and managerial perspective, I believe there are opportunities to be involved in local committees that I would like to take up, and that can be both in a clinical and a teaching setting. And finally, from a personal perspective, because I trained in this deanery as a student, I've enjoyed living in this region and I'd like to stay close to my social network. So can you see in this answer, I've used the CAMP structure to give a well-rounded answer touching on each of the major aspects of my role. And I've mentioned specific benefits of the SFP in for example, in my case here, for each of the key points. And you'll also notice that I've used one of those signpost phrases at the start of each answer. So that in case you haven't seen any of the previous talks, a signpost phrase is a phrase which you use at the start of a paragraph to indicate what it is you're going to talk about in that paragraph of thought. So in this example, it could be from a clinical perspective or from an academic perspective. And that's a really effective interview technique for letting your interviewer know which aspect of the structure you're talking about, and also helping them to follow through your logic and follow through your answer. And this sort of structure, as I say, it can be applied to any motivation question. So now that we've talked about the CAMP structure and we've gone through an example of how to apply it, I want to share my top tips for this particular type of question station. So in terms of things that you can do to make your answers as effective as possible, the first thing you need to do is really research your deanery and the post you're applying for before the interview. So a lot of the deaneries are very helpful, and they include kind of handbooks of all the programs that they offer and what the key benefits are. So make sure that you read those and get an idea of the team that you'd be working in, the notable professors and doctors that work in that team, and what research they produced recently, and make use of those and mention those specifics in your interview. When you're answering these questions, it's very easy for you to jump straight into the answer and start rattling off. And what that often leads to is quite an unstructured, disorganized answer. So whenever you have one of these questions, always make sure to pause for a few seconds to gather your thoughts before you give an effective answer. And as we've mentioned, to make sure that your answers are as well-rounded as possible, try to touch on each of the 4 points of the CAMP structure, and particularly think about the managerial and personal aspects, as well, as these are things that people commonly miss off. As we've said before, make sure that you have a firm understanding of what the SFP and in academic training can offer you in general, and what the difference is between these programs and the normal foundation program, because that's the crux to selling yourself as an SFP candidate. And finally, as we looked at in the example, make sure you're using signpost sentences to structure your answer in as effective a way as possible, and make it super clear to your interviewer which part of the structure you're on. In terms of things to avoid, make sure that you're always really specific about the benefits of SFP and academic training, because if you're ambiguous about this, it might suggest that you haven't thought that much about what your career goals are and why academic training is for you. So make sure that you touch on these points. You also need to avoid making your answer too list-like. So when you give your answer, try to think about key points and key benefits rather than listing every possible benefit. When you're giving these answers, you should try and aim for an answer time of about a minute, maybe a minute 20 seconds. So that way you're not kind of talking for too long, and it gives the interviewer space to ask you further questions. So that's the kind of advice for the motivation type questions. I just want to pause here just in case anybody has any questions about that at all. So feel free to type them in the Q&A. I'm very happy to answer them before we move on to the next type of question. Okay, I think we're happy with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the skill-based questions. Don't worry if you're still typing or anything. There will be more points to ask me questions as we go through. So I will pick up any questions that crop up later on in the talk. So now that we've talked about the kind of motivation type questions, let us move on to talking about questions centered around skills. And these questions are very common, and they essentially are looking for you to demonstrate that you've obtained relevant experience and you have relevant skills that you could bring to the program. Because don't forget, there will be a lot of competition for these posts. So you need to demonstrate that you have the appropriate experience to maximize your experience from this post. So classical examples of questions that come up in this side of the station are questions such as give an example where you were shown a certain skill, or describe a situation where something happened and how you approached it. And often the skills that these will center around are the skills that are included in the person specification that I mentioned in the white space questions talk. So if you haven't already, go back and have a look at the skills that they mention in the person specification and try to think about an example where you've demonstrated each of the skills that they've included in that specification. So the best way to approach this sort of skills-based question is the STAR technique. And those of you who have been to the Whitespace question talk will remember that I talk through this, but in case you haven't been to that talk, I'm going to go through it again now. So this is what STAR stands for. The first sentence should be about the situation. So essentially you need to pick an example that's relevant and briefly outline what is happening in that scenario. And then within that scenario, you need to explain what the task was that you had to do. So what was the particular problem that you need to solve, and what was the kind of main crux of the issue at hand? Then you need to think about what you did specifically to resolve that situation. So in this part of your answer, it's really important that you use the first person. So I did this, I achieved that. And rather than using we in the team, because you need to highlight your individual contribution and the fact that you specifically showed that skill. And in describing the actions you took, it's really important to use what's called active language. So verbs that show that you did something in the scenario. And this shows that you are a proactive person that takes action. Then you need to clarify what the specific result was that came out of your specific actions. And if you're able to, try to kind of have specific details to hand. So say, for example, if you led a teaching program, talk about maybe specifics of feedback that you received that were particularly positive, just to be super clear about your answer and make sure that it's unique to you. And finally, you need to focus on the reflection. So essentially, this is the most important section, and it's essentially demonstrating what you learned and, importantly, how you can apply it back to the SFP. Because remember, they're very interested in seeing that you have transferable skills that you can apply in the program. So again, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate how you could potentially use this structure in an interview answer. So let's say I'm in a scenario and the interviewers asked me, can you give me an example where you showed good leadership skills? And this is an example of how you could use the STAR structure to answer that. So I could say, an example when I showed good leadership was when I was president of a society, and I was responsible for organising our annual national conference, in which I had to lead a team of 5 medical students. So in order to achieve this, I defined a clear timeline for my team, and I made a list of tasks, which meant I was able to delegate roles to each of my committee members. And I also hosted regular meetings to check on progress. And as a result of my actions, each team member was very clear on the roles and targets that they had to achieve. And by meeting regularly, I was able to identify and resolve problems early. And as a result of this, we were able to organise a successful conference which had 80 attendees, and we had lots of positive feedback from the conference. So in this scenario, I believe I was a good leader because I set a clear team vision and I ensured that everyone understood their roles, as well as providing opportunities to communicate back any problems that arose. And I would apply this sort of effective communication in my future leadership roles during my SFP when leading projects. So can you see that by using the STAR structure, I've given a very clear answer in which I've described exactly what I did, identified the key skills that made the example, made the scenario effective, and I've reflected on that experience, applying it back to how I would apply it during the SFP. And as I mentioned before, in this example answer, I've used specific statistics such as 5 medical students in the committee and 80 attendees to try and make my answer as clear and as unique to me as possible. So try to avoid using too much detail and describing what happened, but use enough detail to make your answer specific to you and to highlight the how your achievement worked, essentially. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's now move on to talk about my top tips for this sort of skill-based station. So, like with the previous station, always pause before thinking about your answer, because particularly in that pause time, you need to be thinking about what the reflective point is and how that applies back to the SFP, because that is essentially the crux of doing well in this type of answer. And that kind of leads nicely on to the next tip. So when you're answering this question, your minute or minute 20 or so, at least half of that answer, so at least 30 seconds, should be focused on reflection and what you learned from the scenario, why you think it worked, and importantly, how would you apply it back to the SFP? So in terms of kind of preparing for this, before you go into your interview, as I say, look at the person specification and spend time in advance thinking about topics or thinking about situations you've been in that demonstrates each of the skills on the person's specification. Because that means that if they ask you about one of those skills, you already have an answer example in your mind that you can kind of launch into. And as with the previous answer, try to use signpost sentences, so things like on reflection, to signpost where in the structure you are. In terms of things to avoid, as I say, using the first person is really important. So try to use I rather than we. And it's also important to bear in mind with these skill-based questions that they're looking for a degree of honesty and self-insight into yourself and your training needs. So try to avoid giving answers that don't answer the question. So say, for example, if you're asked to talk about a mistake, don't talk about something that's inconsequential. Obviously, don't mention anything that would be potentially dangerous or make them worry about your clinical practice, but essentially they're looking for a degree of honesty and self-insight into your practice, because reflection and learning is a really important part of being a doctor. So try to have that in your answers. And the final thing to avoid is avoid rote learning your answers, because it's really easy when you're practicing to get used to saying things in a certain way. And the problem with doing that is that interviewers will pick up on that. So the way to kind of overcome this, in my experience, is rather than preparing specific answers by writing out your answer, try to think of examples and prepare bullet points for each of the STAR technique, so that you have a vague guide of what it is you're going to say, but you haven't wrote down a specific answer. So every time you deliver it, it comes off as natural and instinctive. So that's the end of the skill-based questions. I'm going to pause here again in case anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask me. Okie dokie. I think we are all good for now. So don't worry if you are still typing. I will take more questions at the end of the session. But for now, we'll move swiftly on to the last part of today's talk, which is how to go about preparing for this motivation station. So the advantage of this type of station, if you have it in your interviews, is that often it's integrated into the clinical or academic stations. So the way you can go about preparing for it and your timeline for preparation will very much match your preparation timelines for the clinical and academic stations. So obviously, if you're thinking about this from a perspective of somebody applying next year, it's important to take a bit of a break from having written your white space questions, so that you can kind of think fresh before you start preparing. And the key with kind of motivation stations as opposed to kind of perhaps the other stations is to spend time on your independent preparation. So as I said before, researching your deaneries and your posts and speaking to SFP doctors in those posts at the moment is really important. And as we've said before, use the person specification to generate example scenarios that you could bring up in an interview and practice making bullet points. And when you first start doing these answers, it's very easy to feel quite uncomfortable with delivering these answers and talking about yourself in the first person. So the way I found helpful to overcome this was to try and practice talking about myself and talking these answers through in front of a mirror, so that I could practice kind of looking directly and gaining that kind of good interview technique, good eye contact, good delivery before I go ahead and practice with other people. So then once you kind of feel confident with your examples and your prepared material, like with the other stations, it's important to practice with your friends. So make use of applicants who are applying to the same deanery as you, because obviously then you can prepare for the same style of interview, and make up questions to practice with one another so you can practice answering to another person. And often the way I found helpful to do this was to combine it with doing the preparation for the clinical and academic station, so that you're kind of doing little mock interviews. And initially you can kind of practice about once or twice a week, and gradually as you get closer to your interview, you can build that up to 3 or 4 times a week to be really effective. And obviously there are lots of opportunities for mock interviews, both through your university online, and I made a little list of the ones that I remembered from last year. Do keep an eye out for those, because they are often free and a very valuable resource for preparation. And the final thing to do is rest before you actually do the interview. And this is really important for the motivation station, as I say, because you want to avoid coming across as over-rehearsed or kind of not genuine. So this rest period is really important for allowing your answers to come across as genuine and relaxed in the actual interview. So now let's talk about resources for preparation, and particularly for the motivation station, I really want to recommend this book, Medical Interviews, which is by Olivier Picard. This book is probably the best book that I've used for this sort of interview preparation. Essentially what it contains is a series of interview questions that are kind of centered around motivation, with kind of tips and structures on how to answer them, some of which I've gone through in this talk today. So you can probably get a copy of it from your library, if not from eBay or from Amazon, and I'd really recommend getting a copy, because that's probably the single best resource for this sort of station. Obviously, make use of SFP doctors such as myself and other applicants that you find that are applying to your deanery, and make use of the kind of free online mock interviews. So as I say, that's a list of the ones that I remember from last year, and I know that the ICSM and one is recruiting at the moment, so do make sure to sign up for that. And finally, in terms of kind of other sources for practice questions, if you don't choose to get the book, you can also look at a website called First Choice AFP, which are really good and has a bank of kind of these sorts of interview questions, focusing on the motivational side. And as we've mentioned before, do make sure to take a look at the person specification as well. So that's a reference for the interview book. And that actually brings us quite nicely onto the end of today's talk. So thank you so much to everybody that's joined tonight. I hope that was useful for you. I think as far as the interviews go, the motivation station is probably perhaps the easiest of the 3 stations, because it's more centered around yourself and how to prepare for it. So hopefully with those 2 structures in mind, that's given you a good basis on which to build on those. But obviously, if you have any questions, do feel free to email me through those links, and I'd be really grateful for any feedback that you can give me through the feedback form if you just scan the QR code. And I'm happy to take any more questions now. Okay, we've had a question come through. So how many mock interviews should we aim to do? So this is a really good question, and I would say the more mock interviews you can do, the better, because this will be quite a new experience to you. I imagine a lot of you won't have done a medical interview since you applied to medical school. So I'd say try to do as many mock interviews both within your groups of your friends and also online as possible. As I say, I think it's important to build up doing these mock interviews gradually. So the way I approached it was I started off by doing about one a week while I was still learning a lot of the content, particularly from the clinical and academic station point of view. And I gradually built that up to doing 3 to 4 a week, both with friends and through online. And what you'll find is that the online mock interviews complement that strategy quite well, because you'll find a lot of the mock interviews, they'll start from around now and they'll kind of increase in number towards the start of November when the interview offers start coming through. So that's why I would kind of recommend starting now with a small number and then working your way up to doing as many as possible in the run up to your interview. I hope that answers that question. Okay. So I'm taking the absence of questions as an indicator that we're all happy with the content. Oh, I've just had another one come through. Are the London interviews particularly difficult? So this is obviously a hard question to answer because I interviewed in London and Birmingham, so I can't speak for what the other deanery interviews were like. I would say that the London interview, it gets a reputation for being very difficult and impossible, but if you do the practice, put the work in, learn the content, it is very reasonable, and it is they have like a fair expectation of you, if that makes sense. And the good thing particularly about London is they're very open and honest about kind of what the contents of the interview are. So they do give you a lot of information about what the interview will involve, and how the kind of interview will work. So I would say all of the SFP interviews are difficult. The London one is difficult because you have to do a lot of learning for it. However, in my experience, it is manageable, it is doable. You just have to be able to put in the time into preparing for it. And I'd recommend going back and watching the clinical and academic lectures I did over the past couple of weeks in terms of kind of preparing for that, because I've tried to summarize everything that I learned the hard way for that interview into 2 talks for you. So yeah, just be prepared to put in the effort, but it's manageable, is the bottom line. I hope that answers that question. Cool. Are there any more questions at all? I'm very happy to answer anything that you'd like to talk about. Okay, we've got another question come through. So when do different deaneries give out the interviews? So essentially, it depends on the deanery and when the deanery timeline works. So say, for example, if I remember correctly, the London deanery let me know in the last week of October, and that's because their interview season runs from early November into kind of the end of December. So if you've applied in London, you'll hear back quite early, and I think a few of the other deaneries do that as well. For some of the other deaneries that don't interview until a bit later, you won't hear anything about interviews until kind of Christmas time. So say, for example, I think for my Birmingham interview, I didn't hear until December about whether or not I'd gotten an interview. So it's something that very much depends on your deanery. And often they will state their timeline in their little handbook that they give for SFP. So if you're unsure, have a look through that have a look through those handbooks, because they will often say in there what the timeline is. Hopefully that helps. So this is a question thinking back to last week's talk, sorry. So it says the London SFP interview includes an abstract, but what can we expect to be asked about? So I go through this very comprehensively in the critical appraisal lecture that I did last week. So what I'd recommend is that you go to YouTube and watch that lecture back, because I go through in a lot of detail what they kind of tend to ask about it. But essentially, as they'll say in their handbook, they're effectively expecting you to appraise that abstract, and you'll be asked questions about kind of the quality of the abstract, and they will kind of go from there. Okie dokie. So I think we're all happy for now. So in that case, I'll bring the session to a close here. Thank you so much again for joining me tonight. I really appreciate your time. Please do fill out the feedback form. I really appreciate your feedback, and I read every response. And as I say, you can watch this lecture back both on YouTube and through the Bite Medicine platform, as well as the previous interview lectures. And I look forward to seeing you all for the next talk in a couple of weeks' time. But for now, take care. See you later.